Pierson and Dr. Robert Stubblefield and our guest co-host who was going to fill in for Bob, but Bob showed up at the last minute. Dr. Ray Shelton is here, and you may have seen him before, and so he's back, and we have a lively discussion. Our primary material today is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, Chapter 2, Sense, Perception, and Volition. Now, in this chapter, we're going to boldly venture into areas where typically objectivists kind of hand wave in this as like we've said enough, there's sufficient ground covered here. And Lee and I, if I can speak of that as we disagree, and we'll find out what Bob and Ray have to say about this. But this should give you a lot of refueling for cognition, because these are some pretty deep key concepts for objectivism. And so the title of our topic today is Adventures in the Anteroom. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lee because, and this will be a 4 or 5 part discussion. So this is just the first part. So stay tuned and be excited as I am, if you will, and hand it over to Lee.
Okay, I actually don't know how many parts. I think we're not deciding in advance. We'll see how the discussion goes. I don't think it'll be one part because there's a lot of stuff to discuss. In the Anteroom of Epistemology, that's Dr. Peikoff's term for the preliminary issues that you need to work out before you get into epistemology. Well, he has a chapter here in OPAR on those issues which he describes as the issues of sense, perception, and volition. I think there are a few other anteroom issues, but anyway, this is a good place to start. And I really appreciate Dr. Peikoff's work, and I want to make that clear at the outset that one of the things I really appreciate about him, as compared with many other philosophers, certainly non-objectivists, but even some in the objectivist area, is he's very straightforward and usually very clear. That is to say, I appreciate Dr. Peikoff a lot when I agree with what he says, and I appreciate him even more when I don't agree, because I can clearly understand where the disagreement lies and can start to deal with it. So that's a really good thing about OPAR. So it's a good place to start the study of anteroom issues. And the anteroom of epistemology, and I added on to it, and psycho-epistemology, because these are preliminary issues in psychology as well. It's one might say it's where I live. It's the kind of issues I'm really personally interested in a lot. I studied perception with a great perception psychologist at Cornell, even though that wasn't my fundamental interest, but I also am fundamentally interested in volition, always have been, free will, and other issues that might be considered anteroom issues like the nature of introspection and other things about the nature of consciousness. So I'm very keen to get into this. And the idea here is we're not going to do a normal study group, of which there have been many for OPAR, just going through every paragraph and what does it mean. Selected issues, things that I have questions or things to bring up about, or Ray does, or Steve does, or Bob does, but those particular things I'm going to focus on. If you have a copy of OPAR, that would be a good thing to refer to. If you don't, you can get at least some of the pages of this chapter by going to Amazon and doing the preview there at Amazon. I think you can get 4 pages or something. You get some of it anyway. But I hope most of you have this section. Probably most people listening now have read this section sometime in your life. But, as we go through, I'll be reading, or we will be reading little segments, snippets to give some context for the discussion. And the starting page is, what page is it? Well, my electronic copy, it says page 37. I don't know if that corresponds exactly to the print.
Yes, it does.
Okay. Sense, perception, and volition. And he points out that epistemology is a science that studies the nature and means of human knowledge, which is a good starting point. And, what's knowledge? He says you cannot, oops, you cannot accept ideas at random and count them as knowledge merely because you feel it. Certainly, that's a good statement. Why not? Well, according to Objectivism, and I'm reading now, quoting from the chapter, the first point is that knowledge is knowledge of reality, and existence has primacy over consciousness. If the mind wishes to know existence, therefore, it must conform to existence. We don't create existence, we conform to it. And he points out here that human knowledge, is based on sensory perception. I would say it's more than just based. A good part of what we know is perceptual in nature. We have actual perceptual knowledge. Now, I'm not sure if I'm not certain what objectivism's position is, because at different places I see different things, but I'm going to say that we have definite knowledge that is not conceptual, it's perceptual in nature, and that concepts, as Ayn Rand says, are condensations of perception. Okay, he points out that at the conceptual level, it's not automatic. I don't actually think any kind of knowledge is automatic, even perceptual knowledge. There is an element of volitional control over what you're doing in perception that affects greatly how much information you get from the perceptual activity. The one example I like to give in this connection is the cocktail party phenomenon, as they say in psychology. There are actually two cocktail party phenomenons. One of them is that if you're at a cocktail party and somebody yells out your name, you will automatically become aware of it. You will perceive it pretty automatic. You don't need volition. It just, bam, it gets into your awareness. And then there are some implications of that. But the other cocktail party phenomenon, which is the one I'm focused on here, interested in here, is that you can, when you're in a cocktail party with a cacophony of conversation, 100 people and they're all talking at once, you can pay attention to one conversation, one thread out of all of that stuff. But you have to do so, this is the key, it has to be done by the exertion of the mental effort of attention. It's not automatic. There's no automatically paying attention to a particular conversation. It's just a cacophony. You have to exert the mental effort of attention. In other words, you have to use will, volition, in order to perceive. You cannot perceive that conversation, a particular conversation at all, without exerting volitional attention. And so that, to me, that demonstrates, in my opinion, that demonstrates the importance of volition and perception beyond question. Now, it's not the same thing as it's not the same kind of volitional role same role that volition has in concepts. It's certainly different, but it does have a role. Not in all perception. Some perceptual awareness is automatic, but as we'll see as we go along, a lot of it isn't. So I just wanted to bring that up now. It's going to come up again. Many of these issues will come up more than once. Okay, so on the next page, what is that? 38 in my electronic copy. Dr. Peikoff says, before you can study conceptual knowledge, which is the next chapter, you have to cover sense perception and volition. They're separate topics, but there are some links. Now, so concepts are, I may read this whole paragraph because I think this is my favorite paragraph. The next paragraph on page 38 is my favorite paragraph in this chapter, so I think I'll read the whole thing. Dr. Peikoff says, since concepts, according to Objectivism, are integrations of perceptual data. Now, I want to stop there and do a little cognitive refueling, as we like to say, to activate some knowledge about a key concept. Perceptual data is a key concept. I'm not quite sure what it means. What are we talking about when we're referring to perceptual data? Is that sensation? Is that the object itself? Is that some kind of representation of the object in your consciousness? I hope that's not it. I'm just not sure what that perceptual data, what exactly that's referring to. Any, you guys have any sense for that? How about you, Bob? You want to say what perceptual data is? He's not quite ready. Well, we could anyway. I'm just raising that question now. That'll come up again. Okay, so an integration of perceptual data, there can be no concepts apart from sense experience. Well, I agree with that. There are no innate ideas. So I agree with that. Although I do want to say that the whole topic of innateness is worthy of further study, and I think we will have a cutting edge down the line devoted to that topic. What can we say is innate and what is not innate is a tricky, difficult subject. But I think I'm willing to say there are no innate ideas. I don't think there's any reason to believe in that. So I'm on board with it. Consciousness begins as a tabula rasa, the old blank slate, in terms of ideas, not in terms of abilities or maybe some other things, maybe even tendencies. I don't know. Anyway, we're referring to innate ideas. I certainly agree. All of its conceptual content is derived from the evidence of the senses. And there's another term, that the term evidence of the senses, I might want to examine further later, but I think I'll pass by now. The sensory perceptual level of consciousness, therefore, the base of cognition, must be studied first. Okay, I'm absolutely. Good point. We must establish the exact role of the senses in human knowledge and the validity of the information they provide. Oh boy. Absolutely. If the senses are not valid, if they are not instruments that provide a knowledge of reality, then neither are concepts and the whole cognitive enterprise is aborted. Yes, uh, the senses, you have to consider them to be valid. There is a tendency among philosophers nowadays, objectivist philosophers, to substitute the word inerrant for valid, and I oppose this strongly. Inerrant simply means not making a mistake, and you cannot make a mistake by sitting in your chair and doing nothing. And that's a useless inerrancy. The senses are valid. They give you knowledge of reality. Ray wants to jump in here. I think maybe I.
Not yet. I mean, there's quite a bit that you've covered so far, and if you want my 2 cents so far, I can give it to you.
Well, let's take a couple cents now and a few more cents later.
Okay. I agree with you with a lot of questions about the terminology that's being used here. So you mentioned the word automatic, and it's unclear to me in this particular portion of the chapter what automatic means. And there's a certain almost passivity that is suggested, or I should say implied, by some of the terminology discussion. And that's related to the word passivity and automatic, in my mind, are linked. And of course, perception is anything but passive. So I think that is something worth pursuing. And again, innate, obvious, I won't say obviously, but again, I agree with you that conceptual awareness is not innate. But of course, we are living beings with faculties, all sorts of faculties, all sorts of sensitivities, all sorts of automatic responses. For example, the suckling response, which is technically not a reflex because it does disappear. But if you touch an infant's lips, immediately after birth, they will begin to suckle. That is an automatic response. Such things as temperament and many other faculties are built into us as biological living things. We are not platonic beings that are dropped from the heavens. And unfortunately, I think far too many benevolent and good-minded objectivists take the wrong approach, that somehow we really are blank slates from beginning to end, and they really don't grasp solidly the biological and the elements of the nervous system, the brain, the parts of the brain, and all of that are geared toward survival value, and they have deep impacts on us and our perception of the world before we even get to concepts. So I just wanted to point that out. I agree with you there. And this term volition is really quite a tricky one. And like you, I think it's not clearly argued for in much of objectivist literature. And the reason I say that is because as we get to the next chapter, objectivism as a philosophical system, I think almost has nothing to say about volition and perception, as those are properly the realm of psychology rather than philosophy. And in the next section, of course, Dr. Peikoff is going to say the validity of the senses is axiomatic. So what more is there to say in philosophy? And I think very little. And much of this, chapter 2, is heavily polemical. As Dr. Peikoff says, the sweeping aside of objections rather than any positive case, because I don't know your position on this, but in my mind, those are actually scientific questions. And I'll just leave it at that there, that these are all worth serious consideration and should not be taken just at face value by well-meaning, good-hearted objectivists who are interested in learning about these topics. Is they are really subjects of the laboratory and subjects of empirical study. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Certainly there's a lot of science involved here. I'm not myself as concerned with the sharp line between those things as some people are, but there is a line. But some of these things that are scientific issues, like is perception based on sensation? That's basically a scientific question. My answer, following James J. Gibson, is no. And objectivism says yes. I'm not sure exactly why. We'll talk about that when we get to the definition, but I'm not as sure. But it does have that conclusion. What basis? What is the basis of perception? That issue is important in philosophical discussion, because for me, the whole error of Kant really is a very simple one. He has the wrong theory of perception based on sensation. And because of that, it's only because of that theory that Kant can posit a phenomenal world separate from the real noumenal world. That's the only way it can he argue for it to come into existence. So if you get rid of that, in my opinion anyway, if you get rid of that sensation-based theory of perception, Kant is out the window. I think that's what Gibson, J.J. Gibson, my advisor in grad school, who identified Kant as his enemy, I think that's what he thought too, that his perception theory obliterated Kant. So it's not I don't think the science is irrelevant, and I'm not sure that there's exactly a sharp line, but there is a line, and many of these things, Ray's right, many of these things are science. The basic nature of perception is a scientific issue. As far as innate, I guess I've already said we're going to talk about that. I'm trying to not get into that too deeply now, but I think we can agree so far for this purpose of this section, that there are no innate ideas as conceptual ideas. And that's all we need, I think, for this purpose. And then the other stuff we will discuss in the future. Okay, I had one more sentence in that paragraph I didn't quite reach, which the last sentence, which is important to me. If seeing is not believing, then thinking is worthless as well. I really like that. Seeing is believing. That is to say, by believing, I think what's meant here is cognizing or grasping or knowing reality. It doesn't mean we're not talking about conceptual belief there, but a grasp of reality, a knowledge of reality is given by perception itself. And I think that without that, if you didn't have that knowledge base function, an actual knowledge base, not just a base of data of some kind, but actual knowledge base, thinking would be worthless. Would be worthless. I think there wouldn't be any thinking. Okay, so moving onward. I don't have much to say about the next couple of paragraphs. We have a section called the census is necessarily valid. Here, I would just stop for a moment, and I'm going to maybe raise this issue again. When objectivist literature uses the term the census, I'm left wondering, are we talking about sensation or perception? I would assume that it's perception here, that perception is necessarily valid. You could say sensation is necessarily valid in a certain sense, but it doesn't tell you anything. Sensation doesn't really tell you anything other than something made this cause the sensation. And the something could be inside you. You don't really, if you press on your eyeball, you can try this if you dare, you press on your eyeball, you get a little flash of light on the other side of the eyeball. And that flash of light isn't from anything outside. That sensation isn't from anything else. Well, I guess your finger is outside. But it's not a finger. It's not an awareness of a finger. And anyway, there are internal sensations as well.
Yes.
Maybe that's
yes.
not the best. Maybe that's not the best example. So a sensation doesn't tell you much.
It is a good example, Lee, in that obviously what's happening in that particular case is the pressure you're exerting on the eye orb is stimulating the nerves in the back of the eye, which we experience that pressure as flashes of light. So that is a very good, I think that is a good example of basically a pure sensation.
Okay. In any case, my point is that sensations tell you almost nothing about, it tells you that something is out there or in there somewhere, something there's a cause of some sort somewhere. And that's about it. So if that's the data, you're not getting very far with that data. Okay, the validity of the senses is not independent accidents to correlate with the fact of consciousness. All right. On the next page, which is 39. Dr. Peikoff says sensory experience is a form of awareness produced by physical entities, the external stimuli, acting on physical instrumentalities of sense organs, which respond automatically as a link in a causally determined chain. This is how sensation works. It's not how perception works. But we have to examine this at greater as we go along. But perception is more of a circular activity than just straight line causation. Passively, basically, this idea is that you're sitting there passively. Sense data comes in. You're sitting there. The sense data impinges on your sense organs. And then signals are sent to the brain, and then there's something in the brain that interprets those signals. That's the model that my advisor Gibson thought was wrong, and I think is totally wrong and is way too passive. But it is the model of sensation. Sensation does work that way. But the point here is, I've got as well make it now. According to James Gibson, my professor, who wrote a book called The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, 1966. The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, arguably the greatest book ever written on perception. I would argue it anyway. Gibson says there are two totally different senses of the word senses. There's the senses considered as perceptual systems, which is a more active sense. You go out when you have something you want to perceive by touch, you do like this. You move it around and you roll it around and you perform your own action to create variation and stimulation from which invariance are extracted that specify the nature of the thing you perceive. And that's distinguished from the senses considered as channels of sensation, which is the passive. You sit there, the things come in, the stimulation comes in. Somehow, at some point, it's converted into a conscious experience. And we'll see. Dr. Peikoff has a good definition of sensation. Many thinkers do not define the term and equivocate on it. So I'm very glad for him to give the definition. But under his definition, I would say sensation has nothing to do with perception, basically. So he says, obeying, Dr. Peikoff now, obeying inexorable natural laws, the organs transmit a message to the nervous system and the brain. That kind of language is appropriate for when you talk about sensation, but not really for perception, which is a more active process, I would say. Let's see if I have anything else. Yeah, I wouldn't say that's good for perception. Okay, the senses do not interpret their own reaction. They do not identify the objects that impinge upon them. They merely respond to stimuli. But response to stimuli, that's again sensation, thereby making us aware of the fact that some kinds of objects exist. We do not become aware of what the objects are, but merely that they are. I do not think that is correct. I think perception can give you knowledge of at an appropriate level of what something is. You can perceive that something is round. You can perceive that something is solid. You can perceive that something is flat. A surface is flat. You can perceive that you can walk, that a hole or a door is big enough for you to walk through. You can perceive that one tree is taller than the tree right next to it. That's given in perception, I think. And you don't need to have interpretation from the brain to know that stuff. Now, exactly how the perceptual system detects those facts. Perception is detection. That's the best way of thinking of it. It's not construction or integration or putting things together into a whole. It's detection of what's there. And how detection works, that's Gibson's work, life's work, that's described in that book and in other sources. So here, when Ayn Rand says, okay, now we got Ayn Rand, the task of man's senses, writes Ayn Rand, is to give him the evidence of existence, but the task of identifying it belongs to his reason. His senses tell him only that something is, but what it is must be learned by his mind. And I believe that's from Galt's speech. When she says the same thing in almost the same thing in ITOE, later work, an Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, she says, I may have the exact quote here. Let me see if I do. Let's see. I don't seem to. What she says in ITOE, as I remember anyway, is that sensation, she specifically identifies sensation. Sensations tell him only that something is, but not what it is. That is certainly correct, and I have no trouble with that formulation that she has in ITOE. But I would go on to say that perception gives you some actual knowledge of the nature, the actual nature, the knowledge of the attributes of of the entities that you perceive. It's not, you don't have to wait for conceptualization to have some knowledge of what something is. I think that idea that you need concepts in order to have identify what something is more in the Kantian realm than the objectivist realm. Kant says that the sensations come in. Now, it's a little different. He thinks that you need, if I understand Kant. By the way, I'm not a Kantian scholar. I don't play one on television, and I have no intention of ever being a Kantian scholar. But my understanding, for such as it is that he thinks that the sensations, which are basically meaningless, come in, and in order to impose meaning upon them, the mind has a conceptual structure of innate concepts of space and time. He's got a whole set of categories, innate categories, and those are imposed upon the data of sense to produce perception. Now, objectivism doesn't advocate that nonsense, but it's the same idea, however, of that you need somehow to do something to perception to make it real knowledge. And I do not accept that idea. I think that there is real knowledge that humans have, and then some animals have, by virtue of perceiving, by perception. Some people get worried here. I might just mention in passing. Some objectivists worry that if you grant that perception, you get actual knowledge, that you are now going to have to grant that perception makes mistakes, because you can make mistakes about knowledge. And I've actually got a pretty good answer to that now, and I'm gonna hold off for the moment giving that answer as to how you can have perception that gives real knowledge about which you can be mistaken, but the mistakes don't come from perception, and they don't come from concepts either. They, according to me, I have another explanation which is coming up soon, but I'm gonna hold that in abeyance for the moment. Because here, Dr. Peikoff says, a so-called sensory illusion, such as a stick in water appearing bent, is not a perceptual error. Now, I actually agree with that. It's not. It's a sensory error, but I don't want to try to explain it further now. Oops. Here, the research staff has come in with from ITOE, the actual quote from ITOE, page 6, is a sensation is a sensation of something, as distinguished from the nothing of the preceding and succeeding moments. A sensation does not tell man what exists, but only that it exists. That's the formulation in ITOE. And the formulation in ITOE I agree with entirely, but I'd go a little further, because I don't think the sensation has anything to do with your knowledge, your actual knowledge of the entity. It doesn't come from sensation, or almost none. It comes from a different activity. Perceptual activity is different from sensory activity. Okay, we'll put that aside here. Maybe I better stop here. I've been going on for a while, but Bob or Ray or Steve might want to chime in with either what I've been saying or anything about the chapter so far.
Well, the first thing I would say, Lee, is that I agree with you, and I think you're entirely correct. There is preconceptual knowledge. The issue here, of course, being, what do you mean by knowledge, right?
That's a good point.
And there is knowledge at the conceptual level, but before the preconceptual knowledge, before the formation of concepts in the human mind, young children and animals know full well what they're interacting with in many cases. And when I say they know full well what they're interacting with, they know, a human child knows that after it suckles and it's 1 or 2 years old and it's continuing to suckle, they know in a preconceptual awareness what the human breast is for and suckling. They know what toys are. Animals know what to eat and what not to eat. Now, obviously, they're not identifying all of these sorts of things in conceptual terms, but they do have an awareness. Again, this is unfortunately, many good-minded objectivists want to hold on to this Platonic idea of this flash of, we know everything about what something is entirely. And that's not how knowledge works. That's not how learning works. And learning about something is a journey which never ends. There's always new information to learn about things which allow us a deeper understanding and a deeper connection. So knowledge is not all or nothing. That is not how it operates. You learn things, and animals, the more neurologically complex animals, also learn things in stages. And later knowledge, of course, the later conceptual knowledge, if properly conceptual, if done properly, does not negate the earlier non-conceptual knowledge. The term in the literature is non-conceptual awareness. And you are correct in the Kantian sense is that for Kant, there is no preconceptual awareness. His categories of causality and time and space and other categories construct out of sensations what we perceive. That's his particular point. But there is preconceptual knowledge or preconceptual awareness that is fruitful and is real and is acted upon by all living, by humans and by living things. So I agree. I agree with you there, and I think that's worth pointing out. And I think it's also worth pointing out that there's this mistake that there's nothing before preconceptual knowledge. I mean, you can observe before humans speak, and you can observe in animals that they are aware of their surroundings and they interact with their surroundings and they do it appropriately. So they do know, in some sense, what they're dealing with in humans before they have language, and in animals which never have language.
Okay. I see at the bottom of the page here, it says, this is a restatement of something I've already disagreed with, I guess. It is the task not of the senses, but of the mind to analyze the evidence. I mean, the evidence of the senses, whatever that consists of. To analyze the evidence and identify the causes at work. So you need, in this statement, you need you need conceptual analysis to identify causation. Now, it turns out that later on, years after OPAR was published, Dr. Peikoff, when talking about induction, did say that you could perceive that there was perception of causality. He's about 60 years behind developmental psychologists and other people on this. It was known, certainly to me, long before this. And there was the Belgian psychologist Albert Michat published a book in the 50s, which translated the title, which was translated in English. The title translated is The Perception of Causality. And I think it's quite clear that simple cases of causality are perceived. And you have a lot of trouble if you don't understand that, getting to causation, because you can't get it from sensation. All you get from sensation is association, correlation. You can't get causation, I don't think. Nobody ever succeeded in doing it. People have tried. Hermann von Helmholtz, the great genius of the 19th century, tried to develop a theory of perception based on sensation, and he added to sensation what he called unconscious inference, a conceptual intellectual process, which is already a Kantian mistake, hierarchy inversion, if you will, and he couldn't make it work. If you read the third volume of his 3-volume work, The Physiological Optics, which I had to do for my PhD qualifying exam, it was tough going, that Helmholtz. But anyway, he made it a mighty effort, failed. You can't do it. You have to start with some things are given, some knowledge is given, and some knowledge of causation in the simple cases, like pushing a ball, not in the more complex cases of particles and particle physics or something. But they have to start, they would never be able to get that knowledge in particle physics without the knowledge of causation in simple cases. You have to have that. So anyway, I think Dr. Peikoff modified his viewpoint. You don't need the mind to identify all the causes at work. Some causes are given in perception. And he says, which may require the discovery of complex scientific knowledge, as long as with the idea of maybe, that's of course true. Then he mentions the bent stick, which is the philosopher's favorite, the old bent stick. If a casual observer, let's see, is that a good place to start? Well, he mentions the bent stick. I'm looking for where he starts the first mention of it. But yeah, if the old bent stick is you have the pond, say, and there is a branch that extends into the pond, and it looks bent, appears bent, and that's the illusion because it's not bent; it's straight. And the usual objectivist approach is say, well, this is a illusion, and illusions are conceptual errors and are solved conceptually. But actually, the bent stick can be you can get rid of the error perceptually, because you can do, there are many things you can do. You can twirl the stick in the water. That's what Gibson pointed out. And if you do that, it doesn't look the way a bent stick looks when it's twirled. The bent stick would go like that, and the actual stick in the water goes like this. It's two pieces, and it goes like, it doesn't look the same. So you could do that. You could pull the thing out of the water, pull it out. You could feel it. You could walk around it, and when you walk around it, you will. There's a pattern in the light that specifies a straight stick, because it doesn't look the same. The bending doesn't look the same as you go around. There are all kinds of things that are basically perceptual in nature that you can do to solve the problem, or to disambiguate the error, or get rid of the error. Now, is that an error in perception when you see it? No, I don't think so myself. I think when you look at this bent stick and you see it, it appears to you as a bent stick, you are looking at an immediate impression from one standpoint, a momentary impression of sensory qualia, and your sensory qualities is the term Harry uses, Harry Binswanger, in How We Know, to refer to form things. There's a temporary, a momentary sensory experience. That's sensory in nature, I would say, not perceptual. And let me say more about that later. Perception involves movement over time, variation in stimulation, and extracting the invariance from the variation in stimulation. That's what perception's about. So perception, you perceive it correctly. The error comes about, and I'll have to explain this more when we get to the part in the book where he brings up form. It's a confusion of form with object. That if the person thinks that, or thinks maybe conceptually, but not necessarily conceptually, because I think animals can make the same mistake. Animals have illusions. That's been shown experimentally. They can see the illusion, the Mueller-Lyer illusion of the lines, and other such things. Parrots, monkeys, I think even fruit flies. But anyway, there are a bunch of cases with animals, so this is not restricted to humans, that kind of mistake. So anyway, we'll come back to this point when form comes up. But you don't need the mind. You don't need it. You don't need to be a scientist and know about Snell's law of refraction or something in order to understand what's going on with an illusion. You can take care of it by actual perception. You can get rid of the illusion by perceiving instead of just sensing. Okay, so moving onward. And I guess we're in, what page are we in now? I have to, page 40. What's the next page? He says, Dr. Peikoff says, the function of the senses, Ayn Rand holds, is to sum up a vast range of facts, to condense a complex body of information, which reaches our consciousness in the form of relatively few sensations. I'm not sure I understand why he thinks that these sensations actually condense a lot of, there's a lot of information in them. I tend to think of them as being pretty meaningless, having very little information connected to them. There's just not much, you can't get much out of it. Yes, Steve.
It's the isolated nerve ending, the mosaic, the booming and the buzzing, and that's supposed to accumulate in a perception. But when you look at the senses in this way that the history of perception has, the channels of sensation is a common term, and this is like a building up of this integration, and then objectivism says it's automatically integrated on the mind. And Gibson is about information pickup, information pickup of perception as information pickup instead of this sensory-based perception. And so walking around the stick to disambiguate it, get more information, sample more information.
Yeah. By the way, Steve, I'm just checking. Is there any activity in the chat?
I will check.
just to check on that, because we can deal with if there is. I have no reason to think there will be, but there could, who knows. Meanwhile, while you're doing that, here's a sentence two sentences I'm not sure what to make of. We perceive a bunch of roses, for example, as red, cool, fragrant, and yielding to the touch. Such sensations are not causeless. Now, there's a sudden slippage or movement between perceiving and sensation, as if they're the same thing. I don't know what's going on there. I would call most of that stuff red, cool, fragrant, and yielding. Most of that is as sensation rather than perception, I would say. So I wouldn't say perceive a bunch of roses as red. I wouldn't put it that way, but he says perceive, and then he goes back to sensation. Why? Why is that happening? I don't really have an answer to this, other than I think there's a little too much. There's enough clarity of definitively separating when you're talking about in objectivist literature, and you're talking about sensation and perception. Often there's this phrase, the senses tell you, or the senses give you. And then I'm not sure when I read that phrase, are we talking about sensation or are we talking about perception? Sometimes it's hard to tell. So I'm just going to register that fact here. He points out that there's a whole scientific description of what's going on when light waves impinge upon the eye, and where they come from the object perceived like a rose. And he says our sensations do not, of course, identify any of these facts. That is true, but they don't identify any facts, sensations. And then he says they do constitute our first form of grasping them. I don't think that's correct. It's irrelevant to the perceiving activity that are first sensations. Then he says, science, here's an interesting sentence, science indeed is nothing more than the conceptual unraveling of sensory data. Now, again, what's this? Sometimes he refers to perceptual data, sometimes sensory data. What are we talking about here? I don't know for sure. Mm-hmm. I hope he's not talking about sensation when he says sensory data, but I'm not absolutely certain. There's nothing here in the context that enables me to decide, or maybe Ray can decide.
Well, I agree with you here. What's interesting, of course, is we have no real access to our sensations. That's not how we experience the world. And Ayn herself says earlier, I'm going to go back to that line about we perceive a bunch of roses. That is true. When we look out at the world, our perception is of entities. That is how we perceive the world. We perceive the world as a set of objects enduring in time. That's really what perception is. It's for the perception of objects, entities. That's our first grasp. And in other places, Dr. Peikoff says we don't have access to sensations. That's an very early stage in the first couple of days of childhood, and that's it. After that, perception is the grasping the awareness of objects, but that to be aware of an object, of course, is to be aware of its attributes and its motions and so forth and so on. So I agree with you. There is a strong confusion here. So we perceive a bunch of roses, and we can go and we perceive that they are red. We perceive that they are cool. We perceive that they are fragrant. These are not sensations. They are percepts, which is something different. So I do agree there is a confusion here. And again, he says our sensations are our first form of grasping. But we don't grasp sensations. We grasp percepts. I should say what we're grasping.
Let me interrupt.
Can I say just for a second, Steve?
Okay.
We're grasping objects in the world, in a living, moving, pulsating world. We are not grasping sensations. And earlier, Leonard does. I'm just going to say Leonard from now on. Leonard does say we don't have access to sensations. So this flipping back and forth between our senses give us, our sensation gives us, That is not how we experience the world. And and Ayn tells us that again, that what we are given is the perception of objects. And as now, the term entities is going to be much later broader than just physical objects. For example, the solar system can be considered an entity and things like that. But initially, we are given physical objects and all of their attributes are given. And they're given to us in perception. They're not given to us in sensation. So it's flipping back and forth is extremely confusing and I think misleading. And again, I think it's part of this of Dr. Peikoff's attempt to give a scientific physiological basis to the validity of the senses, which is unnecessary and confusing. So
Okay.
I'll just leave it. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, there's Ray used percept, so let me take this easy one because one of the willful thinkers says, "What are percepts versus concepts?" And I'll say, "There's no such thing as a percept. That is a construct, I would call it. It's irrelevant. Percepts don't exist, and that's a way that we, think that we're internalizing, but." Perception is made up of invariance.
Well, it's based on invariance.
Sorry?
It's based on the detection of invariance.
Sorry, yes.
As far as the percept, we're going to get to that, which I agree with you. There's no such thing. Percept is a term from representationalist philosophy and psychology. Percept is a construction, an integration of things, a construction of things, and then if you're aware of that, then you're not aware of the world directly. You have this thing in your mind that stands for the world, and we're into representationalism. And I know Ayn Rand doesn't want to be a representationalist, but that language, percept, is representationalist language. It's a little unclear what it means. When we get to the definition, there's a definition offered in this chapter of percept. We can talk about this further. I think you could define, but I would better wait till then we get to that. We better wait till because we can talk to that. We can talk about that more directly. So I'm going to put off answering the question, I guess, entirely, but we will get to it. It's there. I wanted maybe to take a moment, if I could, to read from J.J. Gibson, a relevant paragraph from the Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems from pages 3 and 4 in the Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems. That's Gibson's 1966 masterwork. Gibson says, the active observer gets invariant perceptions despite varying sensations. He perceives a constant object by vision despite changing sensations of light. He perceives a constant object by feel despite changing sensations of pressure. He perceives the same source of sound, not sound. You don't perceive sound, by the way. He perceives the same source of sound despite changing sensations of loudness in his ears. The hypothesis is that the constant perception, when he says the hypothesis, he means his. The hypothesis is that constant perception depends on the ability of the individual to detect the invariance, and that he ordinarily pays no attention whatever to the flux of changing sensations. Now, I don't quite agree. I'm going to stop for Gibson and comment just something because in answer to Ray, I don't totally agree about we don't experience sensations. We don't experience isolated sensations, but we experience what you might call integrated sensations, sensory qualities, but those things are not perceptions. Perception is not integrated sensation. Anyway, just a quick comment, maybe come back to that, but I'm going to go on with Gibson here. The ways in which animals and men pick up information by looking, listening, sniffing, tasting, and touching are the subject of this book. These 5 perceptual systems overlap one another. They are not mutually exclusive. When you sense a ball by seeing it or by feeling it, you're getting information about the ball, and the sense modality is not that important in that discussion. They often focus on the same information. That is, the same information may be picked up by a combination of perceptual systems working together, as well as by one perceptual system working alone. The eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin can orient, explore, and investigate. It's active. It's not just sitting there passively. When thus active, they are neither passive senses nor channels of sensory quality, but ways of paying attention to whatever is constant in the changing stimulation. In exploratory looking, tasting, and touching, the sense impressions are incidental symptoms of the exploration. They're accompaniments, incidental systems of exploration, and what gets isolated is information about the object looked at, tasted, or touched. The movements of the eyes, the mouth, and the hands, in fact, seem to keep changing the input at the receptive level, at the level of neurons, keep changing the input at the receptive level, the input of sensation, just so as to isolate over time the invariance of the input at the level of the perceptual systems. So perception is about detecting what is invariant in the world, what the attributes of things, the nature, identity, if you wish, invariance, identity. Sensations are about variations I wouldn't say detecting, experiencing variations. Perceptions about detecting the invariance. Okay. Where are we here? Maybe I better stop again. It looks like somebody might want to say something. I'm not sure. Go ahead, Ray.
Well, I was just going to make a comment about something that Steve said and that you reinforced, is that you don't believe there are such things as percepts. But again, it depends on what you mean by percept. I mean, part of the problem here is we're using words without precise definitions and enough examples to arrive at a common usage of the words such as percepts, right?
Yeah, that's why I put this off, because we have a definition later in the chapter.
Right, exactly.
And so
exactly.
we can come back to that. We can come back to that.
I mean, and this is a difficult topic to deal with because a lot of the language is metaphorical. For example, you use the word sense impression. Well, obviously, impression here is a metaphorical use. I mean, unless you're literally going to be talking about the chemical and the chemical and physical pressures on nerves,
nope.
there has to be a way to talk about what's going on in the mind, and we have a problem with that in terms of the language. So I wouldn't
Can I just insert something about that?
Please do.
That issue is a constant issue throughout the whole area of concepts of consciousness. All of that stuff involves metaphors, and until that may take a long time. We're not going to clean that up today. We're going to have to stick with some metaphors today.
Right.
But that is a known problem. Ayn Rand makes reference to it, I think, in this chapter on concepts of consciousness. That's a known problem in general with concepts of consciousness, because we don't have the direct. We have to make reference to external reality, analogies with things in external reality. We haven't figured out how to do it otherwise yet.
Right.
Anything else? I'm sorry, I inserted that before you finished, so I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to put that in.
No, that's all. That's all I was gonna say there.
Okay, science is one more. If a valid sense perception means a perception, the object of which is an existent. That's true. Not merely man's senses are valid. Now, see again, he changed from perception to man's senses. When he talks about man's senses are valid, why make that change? I would like to see it just consistently talk about perception all the time, and only talk about sensation as to distinguish from that. So Daniel has brought up the issue of when we should wrap up for today, and I think we probably should pretty soon. We shouldn't go too much past the hour. We're not stopping. We're just pausing if we do that. Let me just, before we do that, let me just look at this next sentence here. Maybe that's a good place. Um, all sense perceptions are necessarily valid. Now, see, agreed. If you mean perception, if we're talking about perception, and again, unfortunately, um, recently, some objectivist philosophers have gone away from talking about making describing the senses as valid and using this weaker term, inerrant, which simply means not making error, which I think actually comes from biblical studies, is where that term derives from. The senses are better than inerrant. I mean, so they actually give you real information, knowledge. You know, you get something from them. You know, it's not just that they don't make a mistake. That isn't the defining characteristic. That's way too negative, by the way. That you should try to look at things positively if you possibly can, and not define them negatively. And inerrant is a negative concept. Um, Maybe we ought to stop there, unless you guys you want to throw something else in. Steve, Ray, Bob.
No, I'm
Maybe this is a good point to call a halt for today, and we'll come back soon. Probably. What do you think? Can we do next week?
Oh, certainly, certainly. There's
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is an extremely important topic in terms of separating out some issues which are necessary, needed, central to objectivism as a philosophy, and again, issues of science and things that need a lot of exploration that have not been explored. And in terms of the historical development of objectivism, we really haven't yet, I think, reached the stage where Ayn mentioned the need for new elaborations, new insights, going over these materials with new knowledge. And as you've pointed out in other talks, and even in this talks, there is a developmental side to phraseology, to formulations from the very beginning of Ayn's writing until Leonard's interpretation of her writing. And there has been a turn among many objectivist philosophers to studying Dr. Peikoff's interpretation of objectivism versus Ayn's own original words, and the differences, and there are differences between those, some differences of some significance. And I think this is I think that what you're doing here is a good entrance into a vast number of topics that are worthy of exploration if objectivism is going to have any real impact in the real world.
Well, that's a whole other thing we could get into another time.
So I mean, just the idea that you talk about,
yeah.
Inerrant, and that is a description that Dr. Peikoff introduced, and that is not a concept that Ayn used.
You know, is that did he? When did he do that? I mean, I don't know, because you know him better than I. That's why I call him Dr. Peikoff, because I've had maybe 100 words with him over the years, and you know him better, so you can call him Leonard. You call. I don't remember him. I don't remember him as the source of the idea of inerrancy. He talks about validity here. Maybe later he brings in inerrant. When did that come in? And was it him that brought it in?
Well, one of the things I was going to bring up, and this is something we can discuss in the future, is in his lecture course. I want to get the title right. In his lecture course, Objectivism: State of the Art, of which I have a transcript.
Yeah.
He does discuss Gibson to some degree and agrees with Gibson explicitly.
Well, I don't remember that. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not right. I just don't remember it.
And
from that series.
He recommends Gibson, and it's in there that he brings up this idea of inerrancy.
Hey, you have the transcript. Could you send me the juicy section?
Yes,
where
of
this
course.
is okay,
I'll
because
be,
I'm interested
Me
in that.
too.
I always
Yeah,
want to
'cause
bring something entirely new to
bring in
to
that because I wouldn't I have the lectures which I've listened to over the years, not recently, the Objectives and State of the Art, and I don't remember that at all. But that doesn't mean
in it.
anything. That doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Yeah.
In it, he brings up the kitten experiment and the visual cliff. He
Oh, that's
recommends.
Mrs. Gibson. And so
Uh,
we have to be careful here which Gibson is talking about. That's Mrs. Gibson. That's Eleanor Gibson, the kitten experiment. That's the developmental approach. Now, it's not
yes.
unrelated, but I'm wondering whether James J. Gibson, which is in there.
Well,
By the way,
can I,
Gibson was known to uh, somehow to Alan Godhealth,
yes.
somehow to James Lennox. David Kelly sent his first chapter of his PhD thesis to Gibson, and we discussed it in Gibson's seminar, actually. So Kelly knew something. None of them know enough, in my opinion. Of course, Harry and I have had many conversations about Gibson, so you know. But
Well,
as far as I know, the other objectivist philosophers don't know too much.
can I give
They
you
yeah.
can I give you a quote just to give you a teaser in your audience for next time?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm quoting from the transcript.
Yes.
Quote: "There is another hero here besides Ayn Rand on this topic, James J. Gibson. I discuss in my book several of his good, terrific ideas. I won't have time to do that in these lectures because I'm cutting out the science to save time. But I recommend, and when I say recommend, I think this is something that everyone will enjoy reading who is interested in how the mind works. It's really unusually striking, startlingly good and informative. It's called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And don't be scared by ecology here. It does not have anything to do with the environment.
Let me stop you right here for a second,
Movement.
right now, because I'm fairly sure this is. I don't know. We should talk about this offline. I'm pretty sure this is Harry, not
No, it's
Peikoff.
not. No, it's not.
All right, we have to discuss this because I'm pretty sure I recognize this as something from Harry, not, and it's not, and he did not discuss it in the book. There's nothing about Gibson in OPAR, zero.
No.
That I'm sure of. But all right, we need to discuss this. Maybe we have a little, maybe afterwards we can talk a little bit. By the way, so one of these times we're going to open up a Zoom room for discussion, general discussion, not today, but we will do that maybe, next time, some of the times. And let me just add one other thing. We haven't even got to the notion of form of perception, where I want to say, I'll just give you the preview, which maybe I already have. I can't remember now. I think there's a phenomenon that we call form of perception, but it would be properly described as form of sensation. It is not properly described as form of perception, and that has definite consequences. There are definitely important consequences from that, and I'm sure we'll get into that next time. So I better stop there.
All right.
Steve, what's Steve doing? I don't know.
So there's just one question by Bonnie Bertrand.
Oh,
where
okay,
she
Bonnie,
says
sure.
She thinks she understands the lead position here, and I want to disabuse her of this, but I appreciate her question. Or
Absolutely.
She says, in quotes, perception is not integrated sensations seems to be the base of Lee's position. And that's a polemical way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's right, but it's not the basis that perception is detection. It's the pickup of information, which is the detection of invariants in the stimulation that specify the objects. And all of that stuff is done by the perceptual system independently of sensation. So sensation, and when you there is a phenomenon that I think you could call integration of sensation, but that is what I think I'd call that form of sensation instead of form of perception. When you see, for example, if you take a certain attitude, you look down the railroad tracks, you're standing on railroad tracks. When you take a certain attitude, you look at it and say, hey, it looks like the railroad tracks meet. That is form of sensation. That is sensory qualities, and that is not perception. Perception is accurate, and when you perceive, you see the tracks. When you see a coin on its edge, and you say, oh, it looks elliptical, That's sensation or sensory quality. When you perceive it as round, which is what it is. And there are many other examples, but I'm stopping there because I think we better not go on for too long here, Steve. But
Yeah,
anyway, thanks, Monty.
yeah.
She's
Thanks,
right,
Bonnie. And
but it is a negative characterization rather than a positive one. I mean, no, she's not wrong.
yeah, he uses those words, Bonnie, but it's a tricky issue. You have to explain it from
Yeah, and we haven't explained Gibson, which we're not going to do in depth.
do.
I do recommend anybody to get hold of the senses considered as perceptual systems. Anybody that's interested in perception should start with that, and you can read it for free on the Internet Archive. There are various places we can get hold of it in other forms, but anyway, that's one place. Okay, Steve, Daniel,
Okay.
we
So
better.
we will adjourn in a week or two, probably more like a week, and we'll be
I
three
say
or
let's
four.
go for next week.
Okay. So we'll see you guys next time, and thanks for showing up. Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.